Good morning. I'd like to share with you my executive summary in regards to my research project for legal research. This project is in relation to law reform relating to discrimination, hate crimes, and serious vilification in particular. So why is this such a complicated subject? Well, ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there is no consistency between legislation in regards to issues of serious vilification and hate crimes. There's Commonwealth legislation, there's state legislation, there are civil actions, and there are criminal actions. But ultimately, there is no uniformity here. The laws that are relevant in Queensland are not relevant in New South Wales. And ultimately, this is a very serious issue that needs to be addressed more formally and more fully on a Commonwealth level so as to codify these things more effectively. But that's a bigger picture kind of situation that we're looking at here. This research project will ultimately focus on the need for Queensland itself to reform its law reform laws in response to a parliamentary inquiry on this topic that has been initiated by the Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk. So the legislation that applies in Queensland is the Anti-Discrimination Act. Now, this legislation has been around for a while and it has not seen as much reform and updating as one would like. Recently, there was an opinion paper published by the Better Laws for Queensland in partnership with the Human Rights Commission that outlined several ways in which this particular piece of legislation is ultimately insufficient to the services of the community. What we find in this regard is that the pertinent section in regards to serious vilification, section 131A, is routinely underutilized by police and by law enforcement. Now, why would this happen? Why would they do this? Well, it harkens to a much larger issue of the insufficiency of this law and ultimately the burden of proof lying on the complainant. Commonwealth legislation, the Racial Discrimination Act, Section 18C, places what they call a threshold test in relation to harm. And this burden of proof rests on the person raising the complaint. Now, the question is that fair? And law, ultimately, people do need to hold control over their own lives, and civil law, as a broad concept, concerns, crimes against people. So from that perspective, you can see how there needs to be a certain aspect of a burden of proof. But this issue is so much broader than what the legislation provides for. Evidence of this can be found in the fact that there is next to no data statistics in regards to various forms of hate crime, such as religiously motivated hate crimes, sexual hate crimes, crimes against women, and crimes against other minority groups. This is a really rising issue, especially given rise to the COVID-19 situation. There has been a significant rise in reported instances of assault and abuse and harassment to members of the Asian community in response to the coronavirus. As you can imagine, that comes from the idea that the virus first began in China, and there has been rhetoric of Chinese people are dirty, Asians have COVID-19, etc., etc. Of course, dreadful things to say to people and completely untrue. Moving on to the arguments at bay and why this legislation needs to be reformed and why it has not been reformed. Well, why has it not been reformed? Very good question. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that anti-discrimination legislation constantly faces the battle of the freedom of speech argument. That is to say, is it infringing upon a person's freedom of speech to impose laws in relation to serious vilification, anti-discrimination, because isn't the essence of free speech that you can say whatever you want? Well, no, it isn't actually. Firstly, in Australia, we do not have an express provision for free speech. We do not have a Bill of Rights. That does not exist. It is an underpinning principle of Australian society that free speech is an important aspect of our liberty, but it is not an implicit right. And furthermore, freedom of speech does not extend to libel. It does not extend to harassment. It also does not mean that you cannot be held liable for your words and for your actions in the event that they are harmful to others. And yet this is ultimately the debate that people have. You know, right-wing political groups tend to be less in favor of reform in regards to hate crimes. We can all ask ourselves why that might be. And yet it does little in the way of serving the community. Recently, the LNP have sought to amend the Anti-Discrimination Act as well as the Racial Discrimination Act on the Commonwealth level, and make that legislation even less powerful than it currently is. So that just goes to show you how even our policymakers are creating a difficult environment for minority groups and why these laws may have suffered in the way that they have. You know, in conclusion, what we can glean from this perspective is this area of law is supremely underdeveloped. You know, we can look at it from a historical perspective and, you know, see how even today, with a lack of reporting and a lack of data collection that truly allow us to get an accurate picture of the situation, it is difficult then to truly tell the extent that this problem exists. We know that it exists. We know that it's a problem from the few cases that we do have reported, but there is no central data collection that allows for checks and balances to assure that this legislation is catering to the community that it needs. Ultimately, Queensland and the Anti-Discrimination Act and Section 131A does need reforming so that it can better serve the community, so that individuals who fall victim to serious vilification have better actions in civil matters, and so that conversely, criminal matters in relation to serious vilification can also follow through even from a civil perspective, because currently the law is such that the case law and the judicial experience is not as effective as it needs to be in protecting these vulnerable minority groups in what is supposed to be a culturally diverse country. Thank you.